Hey everyone, I'm Adam Coster, one of the developers at Butterscotch Shenanigans. We make a bunch of games like Crashlands and Levelhead and are currently working on Crashlands 2. This video is all about one of the tools that we use to do that. We make our games in GameMaker, but recently we've been moving more and more of our game programming into Visual Studio Code, also called VSCode for short. And we've done that through this tool that I've been working on called Stitch. So it's generally available, so anybody could use Stitch to work on their own GameMaker projects. And so this is just an orientation video to show you how that would look in case it's something that you're into. So with that, let's get into it. So why? I mean, GameMaker's already got an IDE, so why would you want to use something like VS Code? Key reasons, and the reason that I started this project in the first place, are because VS Code is an enormous community because it's used by basically every web developer on the planet, plus people in lots of other programming fields. So the community is huge, and also it's a very extensible editor through their extension system, also very customizable, and so the just amount of cool stuff that you can do in this editor is just huge. And so I use it for all my web dev stuff, and I wanted to be able to do stuff in the same place and take advantage of all those cool features. On that note, it's a multi-purpose editor, so it's not just for GameMaker, it's for anything. And so being able to edit all your stuff in one place is really nice. And then finally, if you want to try new stuff like GitHub Copilot and these kinds of new AI features, then VS Code's got those things already, so you can take advantage of that cool new stuff that's coming out. So assuming you think you want to try Stitch out for your GameMaker project, it's good to know what you're getting yourself into. So what is Stitch and what is it not? It's meant to be primarily a replacement for the GameMaker IDE for writing code. That's its primary purpose. The GameMaker IDE does all kinds of other stuff, though. It has a sprite editor, has a room editor, has all kinds of things. This is not meant to replace those at all. So you won't use this instead of GameMaker, you'll use this in addition to GameMaker. But also you need GameMaker anyway because that's where the runner comes from and all that stuff. It's also a launcher for GameMaker and a version manager for GameMaker, meaning that if you launch your game through VS Code using Stitch, and you launch it in GameMaker, then Stitch will ensure that you're always using the same version of GameMaker. So that's really useful for a long-term project, especially if you're collaborating with multiple people or working on multiple devices, so that when you change your GameMaker version, you can guarantee that everybody ends up on the same version. It also can run your project directly, so you don't have to open GameMaker first to run your project. You can just run it right through Stitch using the same underlying runner that GameMaker uses. And then in addition, it'll get kind of the jankier bits. So current versions of GameMaker have this tool called Feather, which is basically this kind of type support system through comments that if you do web dev stuff is the same idea as JSDocs and in fact has the same syntax. And while Stitch supports Feather, it has kind of a different way of approaching it, so you're going to get different results. And it also has some extensions to what Feather does in GameMaker that are not available in GameMaker. And so you'll basically end up with different kinds of type support outcomes when you're using GameMaker versus using Stitch. And then finally, this is a Windows-focused project. We use Windows for all of our development work, and so that's where our time goes. So it seems to work. Like people have reported that it works on Linux and Mac, but your mileage may vary there. So if you decide you want to try it out, where do you get it? So the first thing to do is to get VS Code. So I recommend using the Insider's version of VS Code. Don't have to, but that's the bleeding edge. That's what Stitch is developed against, and so that's most likely to do what you want and work. And once you have VS Code installed, which is what this little window is right here, then you just launch it and then go install it. So in your sidebar in VS Code, this little actions bar, you're going to see this little pile of bricks. These are your extensions. I have a whole bunch. So you won't see exactly what I see because I got a whole bunch of stuff installed. But you'll see this guy. You just pop this open, search for Stitch. There it will be. And then an install button will appear. Click that button. It'll be installed. Then once you do that, you can use the color theme and the file icon theme that come with Stitch. Why would you want to do that? There's tons and tons of themes you can choose in VS Code. You can make your own. But any one of those themes may or may not have sufficient support to make it so that you get good GameMaker language syntax highlighting. I tried to set things up so that things will generally kind of work out of the box for themes that support, say, JavaScript, for example. But there's still stuff that is unique to GameMaker, so that stuff has to be uniquely set up in a color theme. There's some instructions on the Stitch extension page to tell you how you can customize your own color theme, so that you don't have to use the one that comes with this. But for ease of use and for quickly getting into it, you can just pop open Stitch, set your color theme to the theme that comes with this. It's called Seth's theme. Seth is our programmer, and so this is the theme. We basically designed the theme after what he had designed his GameMaker theme to look like. Similarly, you can set the file icon theme. This basically provides a bunch of icons for GameMaker specific file types that are not likely to be covered by other file icon sets. Again, there's tons of these in VS Code. Again, you can make your own. But for convenience, we just have some that we ship with Stitch. So that's how you get it. Once you got it, then you'll want to open up your project in VS Code. So the Stitch extension will find your project kind of wherever it is once you open a folder. So you can kind of open any folder in VS Code as long as somewhere nested in there is your GameMaker project, and then Stitch will automatically find it and automatically load it. It can also, if you have multiple projects in there, it'll actually load multiple projects. I don't recommend that because it can start to get kind of slow and there's a little bit of jankiness around that, but you could. If you haven't already, as you start looking at your code, you might decide to update your theme, update your colors. And then you'll basically want to be able to, like the quickest loop, if you just want to use this basically just to make sure you're using the right version of GameMaker, you could just do it for that. So on the sidebar, you're going to see the Stitch icon. This will bring you to the project section, which is basically the same as the asset browser in GameMaker. So if you open this thing up, you'll see on this little bar up here, you'll see some commands that you can use. And if you hover, you'll see what they do. So this is run your project. This is open it in GameMaker. And so if you click this thing, it'll fire off a request to open GameMaker. GameMaker will open. If you don't have the right version of GameMaker for your project, then Stitch will install it for you and then launch that version. Once you have the right version of GameMaker installed, then when you hit play, it'll just run right through Stitch. Same way it does in GameMaker. Also note that there's a sort of extended play button that'll let you choose your config and choose whether it's YYC or VM, so that if you want to do something besides whatever your defaults are set to, then you can do that instead. And then finally, this whole idea of being able to choose what your GameMaker version is for your project and keep it that way. The way that Stitch does that is it just looks at your project file because that includes the last used version, and it just makes sure that the game launches with the same version that is. But if you want to change that version, then you can also do that with Stitch. So you can go to Stitch and set GameMaker version, and this opens a unified feed showing all the different release notes from all the different kinds of branches of GameMaker and the IDE and the runtime, all stuck together into one thing, so you need to look at a lot of different websites. You can see if you can toggle these on and off by going to this takes you to your settings, so you can choose to only look at stable releases, for example. And then you just have all these summaries. You can click through and read about what those changes are, and you can just click to set any of these versions to the current version for your project, and then that will make it so that the next time you go try to run or open the project, it'll try to use that version. So this is a very handy way to make sure that everybody that is working on a project is using the same version of GameMaker. So with that, you've now got what you need to get started and to use VS Code, VS Stitch to work on a GameMaker project. And so the rest of this is now more kind of details of how do you get around your project, how do you edit stuff, and all of that for people who are less familiar with all the cool stuff that VS Code can do, or just want to make sure you can really quickly see how to do the stuff that you're used to doing in GameMaker without having to go dig for it. So most important thing, code navigation, being able to get around all the different stuff that's going on in your code base. So like I noted, over in the sidebar over here, you've got your little Stitch icon. This takes you to your project listing, so you can see all of your assets. There's a filter over here where you can basically create filters that do different kinds of things. So here I'll make a filter for the word array. This will then create a new listing of all the stuff that has the word array in it, for example. Can toggle this on and off, clear it, have multiple filters so that I can switch between filters that are then saved. So it's kind of a nice way to make it if you're gonna look for stuff by looking at the sidebar, then that can help you do that. But there are better ways like Control T. So Control T, oh, I'm inside of this file right now. So if I'm in a GameMaker file and I hit Control T, just like in GameMaker, same hotkey even, then I'm going to end up with a list of all of the different kinds of. So you're seeing a whole bunch of stuff that's not GameMaker because, again, VSCode is generic and there's a whole bunch of stuff in this folder besides GameMaker stuff. So once I start searching for something, we'll kind of narrow that down. It's like for array. So now down here you can see, oh, here's all of my Crashlands array related things, right? So this is basically a general symbol search where it'll find all your global symbols plus a lot of more local ones, and to make it really easy for you to just find parts of your code that you want to look for. So you got that thing for Control T navigation. Control P is how in VS Code in general you find files. So if you hit Control P, you'll pull up the file picker. You can start searching loosely for stuff, and then open up a file that way. It's a little weird to do that for GameMaker projects because in GameMaker there's some behind the scenes files, these like .yy files and stuff that make everything work that you normally don't see in GameMaker or in the GameMaker IDE and that you normally don't want to edit. But in VS Code, all of those things are visible. And so it's a little weird. You might find stuff that you're not expecting that way. So Control T is usually the better way to find the stuff that you're looking for. Control Shift P on Windows anyway is going to bring you to the command palette for VS Code. So this is where you can start searching for all the different cool stuff you can do. So if you open that up and search for Stitch, I've prefixed all the commands with Stitch so you can just see the list of things you could possibly do. And then you can trigger some command that way. So that's kind of like the broad way of how do you just kind of navigate around the project in the kind of the really most zoomed out sense. But the coolest stuff that Stitch provides is the more localized navigation. So as an example, if we've got some GML file open, we have these two concepts, go to definition and view references that allow you to really quickly just navigate around a project. So for example, in this array move function, we got all these variables in here, right? So if I were to right click on this thing and look at go to references, then I'm going to see all the references to this exact variable, right? Now, notably, this is literally that same variable. So if there's another variable somewhere else called underscore array that isn't the same underscore array, then those will not be included. So it only finds the ones that are actually that same variable. Similar with go to definition. So I can find some reference to a variable somewhere, go to definition, and that'll bring me to where this thing is initially declared. So this works on globals. It works on it works on functions. It works on everything really. So if I take like a global function like this and say find all references, then over in the sidebar, oh, here's the different places this thing gets used. Then I can go click into those and see those places, right? And then same deal again with going back to definition. If I right click this and say go to definition, back where I was. So it works on macros, it works on globals, it works on basically all the symbols that are in a GameMaker project. So that's really useful, but as you're kind of navigating a lot of code and trying to keep track of where you were and all this kind of stuff, you can get lost quickly and it can be really hard to make your way back to where you were. So that's one of the killer features of VS Code is just it keeps kind of a history of where your cursor has been and you can move backward and forward through that history. So here I'm just back on this markdown file, right? And if I hit Alt left or kind of knock my middle mouse button to the left, you can change that to other things too. Then that'll take me to where I just was. So if I do that, then here's where I was. If I do it again, there's where I was before that. If I do it again, back with that, because I was there first and then I could do a loop, right? And so on. Then I can also go to the right and go back through that if I want to. So when you take all of those things together, it just becomes really easy to very quickly navigate through stuff in your project. So if you're going to use this and try it out, I would highly recommend just just making sure you memorize this stuff and just practice using it, because that's going to allow you to just fly through your project. And then we also have the ability to open your project save folders. This is a little bit of an aside, but also really useful, so that if you're working on a project and you want to look at the save directory for where your project saves to locally, to, for example, delete temporary files or delete a save, so you can, as you're doing development work, you can clear stuff, right? Then you can just open it up and it'll find the right location, pop that open in VSCode for you in a separate instance, and then you can go do whatever you need to do there. Okay, so that's kind of how you get around your project. And there's also the actual editing features, right? So VS Code supports all kinds of features for languages in general, and I've tried to make it so that Stitch supports as much of that as I can with GameMaker. So if you were to hover over any of your variables or hover over any of your function names or any of that kind of stuff, if there's any information that Stitch has about that, then it'll try to present that to you. So here I'm seeing the description from the JSDoc describing this function shows up here. If I go somewhere else where this thing is used and I hover over that same thing, I'll see that exact same information. So that way you don't have to be looking back and forth at your code to figure out what a thing is doing. And it uses the same mechanism that GameMaker uses to do this, exactly the same idea. And so that way, if you document stuff in GameMaker or in VS Code, they should still just show up in both places. So we've got hover support, we've got autocompletes, and since Stitch knows a lot about your code, then it tries to do really context-sensitive and context-dependent autocompletes. So if I'm inside of this code block, for example, and I trigger an autocomplete with control space, then I'll see the local things that live here, as well as all globals, but that's all I'll see. So I'll only see stuff that I could actually use here, right? If I wanted to look into a struct, for example, and I just had struct dot, and then again control space, trigger autocomplete, then I would see only the fields inside that struct that I could use. And that way it can be really easy to accurately get stuff without having to constantly be looking back and forth and how your code is defined and all of that. So that's really nice. And then we've got copy as type. So to get everything to work really well, it's best to provide type information, because that way Stitch and GameMaker through Feather actually know what your code is, because GameMaker is such a dynamic language that it can be otherwise just way too difficult for it to guess before it runs what could possibly happen. And so this one feature in particular that Stitch adds that GameMaker Feather does not have is this type directive for JSDocs. And so there, for example, I can, before I have a variable definition, you can see I also have these autocompletes for JSDocs also, since those can be hard to remember. So if I want to specify the type of this thing, then I can say, okay, this is a string, right? And this isn't accurate because this is actually an array. So let's just wrap this thing in an array. Blep. There we go. So now if I hover over this, it's like, hey, this is an array of strings rather than just an array of who knows what. So you can use this to provide Stitch with the information it needs to help you as much as possible as it's working on your code. You can also provide descriptions this way. Here is a description on variables. So GameMaker only supports this on functions, but Stitch also supports this on variables, although at least it's supposed to. It looks like at the moment it's not behaving. Still not behaving. Okay, so maybe it's broken right now, but it's supposed to do that. But if you want to be able to specify a type, you need to be able to get a hold of that type name, right? And type names can be a little bit ambiguous. So Stitch uses the same naming scheme that Feather uses. But it can be a little tricky, right? So remembering that it's a capital array, for example, or if you're trying to find a particular constructed type, then you need to prefix it with struct dot and so on, and it can be kind of hard to remember and a little tedious to type. But if you're using Stitch, then again, you got all these autocompletes, so you can just type parts of things, and then it'll filter out the list, and you can just enter to get it. And then if I were to start saying like, ooh, I want some struct, then I can get autocompletes for that, right? If I know that I'm looking for, I guess here, a cursor. You can see I only typed BC, and here the top thing that comes up is a type name, right? Because Stitch knows that only type names can go in these little curly braces, and so that's all that it gives you, and it makes searching for those things really easy. So I got that. And then because, again, Stitch knows about all of your variables and stuff, and it knows which ones are the same one and so on, then it also lets you do renames, which is a very nice feature that I've gotten used to in other languages. So I can just basically hover over any of these, or just right click on any of these things and say, hey, let me rename this symbol, and we'll call this ooh an array. And you can see it renamed it everywhere. Ooh, it missed some spots. Ooh, we're seeing some cracks in the system. Oh, no, never mind. That's right, because this one was called array. I thought I was renaming that one. Never mind. We didn't see cracks in the system. It's working as intended. So anyway, the point being that since it knows what all these variables are, which are the same variable, then it can actually rename all of them. And so it also works for global things like functions, and it also works for assets. So if you were to go into an object asset or a room asset and rename it, then anywhere that asset is referenced in your code is also going to get renamed. So while this does work really well in general, again, if you don't have sufficient type information available for Stitch to be able to fully infer what a thing is, then for more complicated scenarios, that auto rename might not hit everything that it's supposed to. So again, your mileage will vary a little bit there, but it does a really good job, at least locally and with globals and stuff, because those are always unambiguous. So that's super useful. You can organize the asset tree. You can just drag stuff around it. It just sorts things alphabetically, but then otherwise you can create folders, drag stuff into folders, do it with groups of things. You can rename folders, and when you rename folders, you can provide additional levels of folder depth, and you can see blah blah blah. So now they're in there, and then here's all the stuff that was in there. Or I guess that was an empty folder, so nothing actually changed about that. But anyway, point is you could do all of that stuff, right, that you would expect to be able to do. And then finally, so I had noted at the beginning that the primary use of Stitch for VS Code is as a code editor, and that's really it. But there were a couple features that we needed, because while we do all of our Sprite, all of our image asset development outside of GameMaker, in GameMaker, there's basically two things we need to be able to do. One is set origins of regular vanilla sprites, and the other one is preview a spine sprite before we go through the trouble of opening up GameMaker or getting it hooked up and making sure that it displays correctly in game. So to be able to do these kinds of quick edits or spot checks, we have very basic editors. So if I were to open one of these up, so this is one of those YY files that is a behind the scenes thing you don't normally see. But if I go to this Stitch command called show asset in tree, then if I'm in any file related to an asset, whether it's a YY file, a GML file, a PNG, whatever it is, then it'll bring me in the sidebar over to that asset in the asset tree. So from there, we can see here's this like bobber sprite, right? And you can see I've got the origin. It's probably hard to see, but it's just this highlighted pixel right here, right? And it shows all the frames and shows you on all the frames where that is. So you can see I can drag it around, move this to a different position. I can zoom in and out so it's easier to see. Or I can just set to some default locations, just like you can in GameMaker. So this is really useful for us because we make all of our sprites outside of GameMaker, and we need to be able to easily, quickly set them. And we didn't want to have to open up GameMaker just to do that. So that's built in as this little simple editor. Similarly, we've got this for spine sprite. So go through that loop again, go open up this file, and then we will look at it in the asset tree. And then here is this spine sprite. So I have a nice little preview of JuiceBox. JuiceBox is our sidekick character from original Crashlands, also in Crashlands 2. And got a little spine runner so that I can try out the different animations and blah, blah, blah. This is a suspicious walk. It looks very suspicious. I can do some basic debug stuff here. This is a spine official player, right? So it just does whatever that thing can do. And this also then lists the animation events and how long they last, because those are really key pieces of information that you often need for hooking things up to your animated spine sprites that is otherwise really hard to get a hold of. So that's basically what that does for us. So again, the focus is on code, but we want to make sure that we can stay within the same editor as much as possible while we're doing stuff. And so we do bring little other features in there here and there. Finally, we have importing assets. So this is an experimental feature. It's implemented, but we haven't really used it very much. And so I'm not highly confident that it's always going to behave as intended. But the idea here is, again, I can Control-Shift-P, open up my command palette, and then go look for stitch import assets. I've got a little warning for you to let you know who knows what's going to happen. It's an experiment. And basically what this will do is pop open a picker asking you what other GameMaker project do you want to open to use as your source to import something from. So I'm going to open, so you can see down here, I'm loading this other project. And then this little drop down appears where it asks, hey, here's the list of folders, and I can filter by starting to search. So here's my folders, and then here's all my individual assets, and I can either import a whole folder of assets, or I can import a specific asset. And it'll take you through a few other questions to ask, like, what'll happen if you try to import, but the thing you're importing has some dependencies that you're not importing and that also aren't in your target project. Then what should I do? And so Stitch, because it knows everything about your projects, tries to do a good job of merging stuff in a way that makes sense. So mileage may vary, but it's can be very helpful to be able to use your other projects as libraries. So that's really the summary of kind of your orientation to Stitch for VS Code, how to use it in your project, what it's good for, you can do with it. And the remaining stuff is basically just this kind of housekeeping details. If you want to tweak stuff about how Stitch for VS Code is behaving, how do you do that? So to do that, you would go into your preferences. So Control-Shift-P, you can just start searching for settings or preferences or whatever. Then you can open that up in VS Code. Over here in the sidebar, you'll see your list of extensions. So you could just go like look for Stitch if you wanted to, and it's going to be all organized by extension. Or you could just start typing Stitch up here, and it'll filter with things that have the word Stitch in them, including all the Stitch extensions, Stitch settings. And you can see here's all of the stuff that you could be changing in here. So we just go look at Stitch itself. I would recommend perusing these settings to figure out if there's anything you want to tweak and experiment with to see if you can get some better results for your own projects. Otherwise, the important thing to note there is in VS Code, there's that difference between user settings and workspace settings. So if I go over to my file explorer here, so much stuff in this project. If I go over here and go look at this .vscode folder, then these are basically the workspace specific settings, which are all in here, right? So your user settings are overridden by your workspace settings. So you want to make sure whichever things you store in the workspace are things that you want to use across machines and that also everybody in your team wants to use, because otherwise you'll prevent them from using their own preferences for their settings. But it's a good place to store things like the default config to use for running a GameMaker project and that kind of thing. Okay, so let's say you're using Stitch for VS Code. You run into some issues, or you have some feedback, or you have some features that you want, or whatever. How do you go about dealing with that? So the first thing is, if you're dealing with an issue, is to get as much information as you can. So one way you can do that is by finding the output panel and looking for Stitch in the list of extensions. And then this will show you the output coming out of Stitch as it's doing all of its stuff. And so that might help you triangulate where things are going wrong, and that can definitely be helpful for me if you can provide that in your report. Also note, things can just go a little janky as you're working on stuff. So if you resave a file, so VS Code will just let you save a file even if it already is technically saved, and that'll re-trigger Stitch's processes, and so that might fix stuff if you just resave a file. If that doesn't, you can also reload the whole thing. So you can just do developer reload window. Or you would search for reload window, right? And then it'll just reload the whole thing all in one go, reboot Stitch, all that good stuff. if your issue persists after that, then that's where you go submit an issue. And so to do that, you would go to the bscotch/stitch GitHub repo and submit an issue describing what's going on. More information, the better, of course. And you should also be following the GitHub account. That's not the right word. The GitHub project anyway, so you can see when updates come out, and so you don't lose track of it if you decide that you want to use Stitch. So with all of that, that is basically Stitch for VS Code. We've now been using Stitch as our primary way of working on our GameMaker projects for a few months. There's a handful of features and little bugs that we would like to fix, but for the most part, it just works really well. And we're always making it better and always working on it. So I hope you give it a try, and I hope you enjoy it, and I'd love to hear what you think about it. So with that, have a great day, great whatever you got going on. Bye.